This is Studio 809.
Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Outdoors of Hiking Bob podcast. I am your host, Hiking Bob Falcone. You can find me on my website at hikingbob.com, which has links to my social media accounts, my columns at the Colorado Springs Independent, all the many other podcasts we've done. This one will be number 302 for those of you who are keeping track, and for those of you who aren't, well, you found out anyway. And all that stuff can be found there, including links to my social media accounts. And you can also sign up for my weekly newsletter in case you missed this. I provide a handy link to that in my column and any other stuff that you may or may not find interesting, but it's all there. And all that can be found at hikingbob.com. Today, I'm doing something a little different. I'm interviewing somebody from another podcast, and it's a really interesting podcast. Today, I have Melodie Edwards, who is the host of the Modern West podcast, which is about, and this is going to be very general, but it's about all things West and mostly about Wyoming. Is that accurate, Melodie? And thank you for being here.
Yes, I think our tagline is something like, exploring the evolving identity of the American West. So we're very interested in just how things are changing and moving. What are trends and stuff across the American West?
Well, thank you so much for being here. Your podcast is done with the Wyoming Public Media, which I guess is like the public media outlet for the state of Wyoming. Tell us a little bit about you and your podcast, and then we'll talk about this exciting new season you have coming up.
I am a reporter. I've been at Wyoming Public Radio for, about 9 years now. And I, was kind of a beat reporter for years and years. I covered, the Wind River Reservation here in Wyoming. I covered wildlife issues. I covered climate change issues, water issues. So a lot of those things that are sort of quintessential American Western stuff. And eventually I got really excited about long form storytelling because I actually have an MFA in creative writing and fiction writing. And so I'm very interested in storytelling. And, it was always very frustrating to me when I was doing kind of beat reporting, how much of the story ended up on the floor, that tape that ended up on the floor that didn't end up getting into the story, and just a lot of history that never made it in, backstories that I just was really excited about. And so, this was an opportunity to kind of explore in a bigger format through this podcast. And so, I've really got excited about telling more stories from across the American West. And so that's, this is season 5. So we're on a roll here.
And your podcasts tend to be a series of a short series each, covering a specific topic. So it's a lot different than what I do, which is just kind of blather on for about 40 minutes about different topics here. But I really like that short form or long form limited series type. I just got done listening to one today, the final episode of one. Very interesting stuff. I really like that because I like being able to listen to a series and cover a topic like that. So really exciting about that. You've been covering the West. You're from Wyoming. You've been covering Wyoming. Tell us about this next series that's actually going to be debuting the day this one comes out on May 11th. Tell us about this next series you have coming up and what it's about.
Yeah. So it's all about ranching and really exploring. In the first few episodes, we're going to really kind of dive into a lot of history of ranching and cowboys and just exploring some of the myths that maybe we think we know about cowboys because we've sort of been spoon-fed these ideas from, Westerns in movies and, Pulp Fiction for generations. And so we have these ideas about where the cowboy and where ranching came from, that it felt like we needed to do some myth busting to get started with the season. So we do explore a lot of history, including how the cowboy was originated as the Mexican vaquero and moved northward. And then we get into a lot about just the idea of cows. As we moved west, we really brought cattle with us as a way to civilize places. And that ended up leading to the extermination of bison to make room for all that cattle. So then we're really looking at kind of, okay, well, what has been the impact of all that cattle across the landscape, which is just a species that really is not well suited for the arid West. And so we explore in a couple of episodes the environmental impacts of livestock on the landscape. And then we also look at animal handling and animal welfare. And then we really try to go into, by the end of the season, where we look at what is, how are ranchers kind of learning from the history that we have explored and doing new things. And we're really seeing quite a movement among ranchers in across the American West who are just doing really amazing stuff to find ways to make livestock handling on the landscape more sustainable. And we're seeing a lot of ranchers who are trying to make sure that we're conserving water and forward thinking in terms of, we're looking at a much more drought-ridden future. And so ranchers are doing something about that. They're stepping up, they're reinventing themselves, they're pushing back on a lot of that mythology. And so I really wanted to dive in and find those folks who are movers and shakers. And so a lot of the season is just really taking a look at some amazing stuff that's going on across the West in the ranching community.
You're going to break my heart, and you're going to tell me that Kevin Costner in Yellowstone is not true at all, are you?
Well, a lot of that mythology is it's what we love to believe about ourselves. And you go any place in the world, and you have a certain shape of hat on your head or a certain shape of boot on your feet, and people know you're American because of that. It's who we are. And so that mythology it's become real in its own way. Right. But there's a lot about it that is that needs to be reevaluated, and we need to just kind of take a look at it and poke around and take a hard look at what ranchers really do. And to be frank, it's really hard work. Yeah. I worked on a hay crew for a season, and man, we did not get a day off unless it rained. And so it's a lot harder work than maybe we get to see in TV like Yellowstone. But it's still a very romantic lifestyle, and people love doing that work because they get to be so close to the land.
I imagine it's not a whole lot like Josh Brolin in Outer Range either.
Yeah. I haven't seen that one, but it's a lot of times we get these depictions in TV shows, and it's just a lot of it's really hard work, and it's also that market forces are really pushing back and making it harder. It's very expensive to get into land. You can't buy land in the West anymore. And so, the small family rancher is becoming an endangered species. And so a lot of land is getting bought up by corporations or by the super wealthy. Where I'm from in Colorado, I'm actually from North Park in Colorado, which I'm sure you know about. And when I was growing up there, it was all small family ranchers, but now it's just a few very wealthy people who have consolidated all of those small ranches. And so, it just doesn't, it's not easy to compete with that if you're the little guy. Sure. So we're going to explore in the season how some of these guys, some of the small family ranchers, how they're making it work. And so there's lots of folks out there who are figuring out ways to still be able to do this work and live close to the land and do it right.
Let's talk a little bit about climate change, because I think there's going to be some correlation here between how they're dealing with climate change and how it's affecting probably the smaller ranchers, like you talked about the family ranchers. So we're dealing with, obviously, climate that is changing, and it seems like exponentially faster. We're reading, it wasn't too many years ago, I was at Lake Mead, and it was down a little bit from where it historically had been. Now we're reading that the upper intake for Las Vegas is above waterline. They're not taking any water in from there. Things are getting worse. I can't imagine how that's not affecting ranching in Wyoming. And you mentioned that, ranchers, obviously, they need water to grow whatever it is that their cattle feeds off of, to make cattle so that we can have meat to eat and things like that. This big circle. How are they dealing with climate change and increasing temperatures and decreasing amount of rainfall and snowfall? How are they dealing with it?
Well, it's all hands on deck trying to figure out how to go about this. The droughts are just really making it hard to find water. I know that there is ranchers who are, opting into and being incentivized by the states to, go ahead and let that water, rather than using it through across the whole season. Once they're done irrigating and getting their hay fields, all finished up, they're letting that water flow back into the river. And so that's helping to kind of make sure that stream flow keeps going. One of the episodes that we're going to be exploring in later in the season is about some ranchers who are kind of battling some efforts to drill some really high capacity water wells into the Ogallala Aquifer in eastern Wyoming. And, these ranchers are all kind of working together to and this is a neighbor of theirs that wants to do this. And he says that he wants to use this water, that it's a family, that they want to use this water for irrigation. But, it's unclear what his long-term plans are, which brings up questions about speculation and brings up questions about, what role does groundwater have in climate? We think of groundwater as something that's like hidden away and safe from climate change. But actually, groundwater is all part of the water cycle. And so we're going to really explore some of that science and just kind of get into, how can we protect these, almost like savings accounts, these pockets of groundwater. And the Ogallala Aquifer is going fast. Which could really affect a lot of states across the West. So, we're going to get into, just trying to see where it is that ranchers are, using regenerative ranching techniques where they are not just letting their cattle kind of roam across the landscape, but they're kind of making sure that they stay in a bunch where they really end up eating down the grasses so that it encourages native plants to grow up. And really helps the soil to retain carbon inside that soil. So there's all sorts of really amazing techniques that ranchers are exploring so that they can kind of do their part as we do see the climate changing. What can we do across the West? What are these ranchers are looking for any way that they can to kind of step up and do their part?
It would seem to me that if you have less, like say, snowfall, and you have less snowpack in the mountains, and you decrease the amount of water that flows down from the mountains into your creeks and rivers that provides irrigation, that when you start tapping into deeper and deeper aquifers, that's going to dry up too at some point. That's not necessarily, it may be a short-term answer, but it certainly seems to be a very short-sighted, long-term solution, because what happens when that dries up if you haven't done anything to try to use less water to begin with? So it's a concerning thing, and I think a lot of people are a little too late to the table here. But it's exciting to see the ranchers are on top of this. Is it a harder issue for the small family-owned rancher to deal with than it is the big companies, the mega companies, the bigger owners who own many thousands of acres of land, I guess? Is it harder for that small rancher to kind of deal with that? Is that why they're kind of banding together a little bit?
I think so. In that case, I do think that that's one reason, is that it helps them if they can work together, that helps to kind of fight some of the bigger folks that maybe those pressures. But I do think that there's a lot of times when the small ranchers, we hear a lot about overgrazing across our public lands. But when you have ranchers who are just really not making it and they're living on the edge of bankruptcy all of the time, they're getting less and less of the profits every single time they send their cattle into to sell to the feedlots. The feedlot is not paying them very much, but that's because the feedlots are not being able to sell the cattle very much to these 4 big meat packers who are kind of really monopolizing the market and really manipulating the pricing. So we're hearing a lot about how much these ranchers are struggling. They're just really not making very much of the profit. And that leads them to make decisions when they're doing things on the landscape. They have to make hard decisions because of the bottom line, and they aren't being able to make decisions when it comes to like what is the effects going to be to the environment or to water resources and other things like that. So I do think that they're doing the best they can. They're finding creative ways to do their part, but it's a hard time for ranchers across the West.
You almost, the way you describe it, and I'm picturing, this small rancher, and he's running out of water, and he's trying to get water, and he's working with his neighbors. You obviously can't blame them when they finally say, we're just going to have to sell to somebody else, and hope that they're responsible. And we tend to think, and maybe unfairly, that these big companies are not responsible. I don't know that that's true. It's a mindset we have. All that big companies going to ruin everything. They obviously have some interest in sustaining themselves also and have more resources. Are you also seeing, or are you seeing where ranchers, and we're seeing this here in Colorado, as you may be aware, in Arizona and places like that, where ranchers, instead of, maybe they're not selling to a big ranching outfit, they're selling to developers who are then plopping down 1,000 houses. Are you also seeing that happening in Wyoming? And what's they need water too, so that's not necessarily fixing anything, is it?
Yeah, we're for sure. That's the thing is that, people have worries about all this the cattle across the landscape, but there's also a problem that if these family ranchers are forced to sell, what's going to go into the place of those ranches? At least they are keeping it as open space, and so helping them, giving them the resources that they need to be able to take care of that land and stay in business is for the benefit of the public good. And so it's a good question. And I think that, we saw a little bit of that here in Laramie. There was a big debate, it's still kind of ongoing, where there were ranchers who were giving leases to a wind farm right outside of Laramie. And there was, a lot of folks who lived out there who didn't want a wind farm moving in right outside their cabin door. And it was frustrating to them to have giant turbines maybe churning, but it helps the ranchers to sustain themselves as in the ranching industry, to be able to do that, to work with these wind farms. So it's a complicated question. Would we rather that those ranches were developed so that we don't have wind farms moving in, or fossil fuel development, whatever it might be, that's helping to make sure that those ranchers can keep doing what they do and keep that open space available. It's a real struggle.
You go out into eastern Colorado and northeastern Colorado, and it's just, wind farms as far as you can see. And there's obviously, I have mixed feelings about that. I think they're a blot on the landscape. As a photographer, I like, go take a landscape. I don't want to take a picture where, there's 1,000 windmills, but I understand that rancher who may own that property is getting he's got probably a fairly lucrative deal to lease that land. So he's, kind of making ends meet, and it is sustainable power as opposed to more coal-fired plants and tearing up the earth. And I can imagine how it is out there. Are ranchers able to have these wind farms coexist with their ranching? Does it affect the ranching at all? Obviously, other than taking a plot of land here and a plot of land there to plant it, plop down one of these things. Are they able to have these things coexist pretty well?
Yeah, it really does help. It coexists really well for them. And, I talked to the Wyoming Stock Growers Association, and, they mentioned that there's just more and more options for ranchers to help kind of keep them afloat. Things like wind farms. And, fossil fuel development has long been kind of relied upon by ranchers as, and they've been coexisting, for a long time. And now the option of wind farms really makes that another option. And the Wyoming Stock Growers Association, they talked about how just more and more of those options, just helping ranchers to stay afloat. Those are something they're seeking out. So another one that I will have an episode about in this next season is about ranchers who are offering carbon offsets to different companies, individuals. So what they do is they, and there's one actually in Eastern Colorado, which we'll be interviewing, and they have, opted on their property to stop tilling the land indefinitely, forever. They will keep that land from being tilled, keep the carbon in the ground, and they're protecting wetlands on their ranch. So that they can offer that as a way to help them sustain themselves financially to any businesses who want to help, make sure that land continues to stay untilled and a place where carbon can kind of stay in the soil. So I think that is a really interesting and exciting option for ranchers going forward. Another option for them to help make sure that they can stay in business.
We see here in southern Colorado specifically a lot of small ranching operations, and they are being assisted in protecting their land from development with these various conservation trusts and things like that. Are you also seeing that happening in Wyoming, where they're helping that small rancher keep his farm so he can keep it, or his ranch, and not have to sell it to a housing development or a big time operation? Are you seeing that also up there?
Yeah, definitely. And that's really a great option for ranchers who are really interested in protecting sort of the environmental, and they want to make sure that this land stays open and wide and a place for wildlife. There's a lot of ranchers who are making sure that they're developing those kind of conservation easements. And so that's been a really great opportunity as well for ranchers who, one of the problems that we're seeing in ranching is that rancher is getting older and older. The median age is someplace in the 50s nowadays. So they're really, not seeing a lot of young people who are, going out into the world and coming back to take over those ranches. That's just not happening like it used to. And so where will those ranches go? If they're not going to be able to stay in the family, then a conservation easement of some sort, a collaboration with the Nature Conservancy or something like that, that's a really great option. And I think that is how these carbon offset opportunities are also, they're kind of working with those conservation folks to make those work. And so that's yet another level to that. So that's really, I think, something that's developing quickly in the ranching community.
None of these answers are very simple, are they? These things are very complicated, and
true.
There's no simple answer to any of these things. One more question about this, about water and this. Fracking has become a thing that, drilling deep, and injecting steam or what have you to try to extract just a little bit more fossil fuels out of the ground. How has that, you hear things that it causes earthquakes and water leaks out and you lose water. How is that affected? Are ranchers allowing that on their property on leases? Is that they get the money, but maybe it hurts them in the long term? How is that affecting things for ranchers up there?
Yeah, I've seen that quite a bit in North Park, where I'm where I grew up, and there are ranchers who are allowing fracking onto their property, and it's affecting a lot of the neighbors. I interviewed a woman who lived right next door to some of that activity, and she was feeling the shaking in the earth, and she was, seeing it affecting wildlife in her area, and just the amount of traffic that's going back and forth on those highways is pretty dangerous. And we are seeing like trucks that are tipping over and spilling. So those are definite concerns for folks, but these ranchers are, like I said, they're really financially struggling, and so there's a real juggling act and hard decisions being made about what to do, and some ranchers do opt to go ahead and partner with these oil and gas companies to do that kind of stuff.
Have you heard from any of those ranchers who have done that and maybe later on wish they hadn't? That it disturbed their livestock, that they couldn't produce, or that they ended up losing water? Have you heard from any who said, "Yeah, I'm going to lease it to them, and then maybe I wish I hadn't done that"?
I think it's so lucrative that some of those downsides all end up becoming, it pays for that and kind of compensates. So no, I haven't really come across that in any of my interviews or conversations, people who really regret that. Not really. Mm-mm.
Gotcha. Okay, fair enough. Let's move on and talk about, this has been a great conversation about this. It's become a topic that's been talked about on my podcast more and more often as we see things just drastically change. But let's talk about the myth of the cowboy.
Okay.
I grew up with, I'll tell you right up front, one of my favorite Westerns is High Noon. And of course, I'll sit here and watch John Wayne movies all day. My Darling Clementine takes place in Monument Valley, which somehow substitute for Texas, although they're 1,000 miles apart. I guess that's a case of myth kind of interfering with reality. That's what I know about the West. That and Blazing Saddles, which obviously has nothing to do with reality with the West. But tell us about what people perceive as the West, what they see in TV. We talked about Yellowstone briefly. And movies, and what is it really like? How much are they alike, and how much are they different? And I'm sure it's something you'll talk about in the podcast, but tell us about that. How do these things mesh?
Yeah, we do. We have kind of like the these perceptions from those old Western movies that we all love. We can't help it. We're still even making those kind of movies where we see these kind of, almost vigilante type characters. And they're roaming across the West, and they have no home. They're just kind of like these restless souls that are just roaming about. Usually a white guy, and just kind of like this kind of character that we visualize and that we love. We just have this passion for him. He seems like somebody who, does the right thing. He's, his heart is in the right place. He can't stand seeing the underdog hurt in any way. And so he's out there, kind of doing what he has to do. And we really just admire that kind of character. But I interviewed this historian, a folklorist, an American folklorist, and he talked to me a lot about how it's kind of like a split personality. This guy, this sort of cowboy character, and on the one hand, we've got like this law-abiding. He's the sheriff usually, and he's a good guy, and he's trying to like bring sort of a steady hand to whatever community that it is that he serves. And then we've got this sort of outlaw character who's a vigilante, who's going to just, he's not going to call the police when he thinks something's wrong, right? He's going to go out and just handle it himself. And it's just this, so this cowboy image is both of those things. But as I talk about in the podcast, we love the vigilante better. We are, there's lots of songs about Jesse James and, all of these Butch Cassidy and all of these guys. There's not so many songs about those sheriffs and the good guys that were kind of trying to bring a law-abiding way of life to the Wild West. We don't hear about them. They're not nearly as well loved. So we definitely have this attachment to that vigilante, and we see him, like you watch Die Hard or something like that, and there he is again. He's right. This cowboy, right? And so when we really look into that cowboy history, first of all, that cowboy came from the Mexican vaquero. He was a guy who was trying to, a lot of those Mexican vaqueros actually had descended from sort of Moorish slaves who had come over with the Spanish conquistadors, and they had amazing riding skills. They were amazing horsemen, and they came to Mexico where they were trying to raise cows. And this was an animal that had been raised in Europe in places where there was lots of grass. And here we are trying to release them onto a landscape where there was very little grass.
Next to being a desert, for crying out loud.
Yeah, exactly. And so, these guys were like, okay, well, if we're going to have to raise this animal on this landscape, let's figure out some techniques to do that. And they developed the lassoing techniques so that they could get those cattle back in. They, the sort of all of the saddles and the boots and all of that was developed by these Mexican vaqueros just so that they could handle cows across this gigantic landscape. So, and so, they really ended up those cattle drives. How they ended up having to handle large numbers of cows across a very large landscape. And so they had these giant thousands of miles moving these cattle. And that was really the era of the cowboy, was those cattle drives. But it was actually a very small window of time that those cattle drives were happening. In the late 1800s, for a little while, we had these giant cattle drives. And then pretty soon, they invented the barbed wire fence and started fencing that off. And that was the end of the cattle drive. And it was also the end of the true cowboy era. It's a very short-lived period of time. So, so there's a lot of misconceptions about them. And those cowboys, they were not vigilantes, nor were they really these high-minded guys. They were, hardworking guys that really had very little money, really struggled. They were kind of the lowest of the low, and were treated pretty poorly by the ranch owners. And so our ideas about who those cowboys are is pretty off. Let's put it that way.
I'm reminded of a couple of things, and you talk about the Mexican cowboys. When I've gone to the National Western Stock Show, and we love going up there, and it's a night of entertainment. And obviously, if you take the time to go down where the cattle are, you get a different feel than if you sit in the stands and watch shows. But one of the best shows ever at the National Western is watching the Mexican cowboys do their thing, and it is so impressive to watch. And obviously their horse handling skills are just off the charts. They're great. And I'm glad that you reminded people that's actually where this started. It wasn't something white male European imports brought up. They brought up, and watching them do their thing is just so incredible to watch, and so awe-inspiring to watch. I've heard, and I've done a little bit of research in this, that one of the myths we have is like, every little Western town, everybody carried a 6-shooter, and there were gunfights at noon on the front, and from what I've read was a lot of towns didn't allow you to bring guns in there, and you most certainly were not going to have a gunfight at noon and on the main street in town, and how that myth is perpetuated. One of my favorite movies is Liberty Valance, The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance, and I think this kind of goes right to what you're saying. One of the last lines in there is when the legend becomes fact, print the legend, and I think that's exactly where we've ended up with
Yes.
this. And then some science fiction movies. One of my favorite science fiction movies, it goes back a number of years, is called Outland, and it features Sean Connery, and it's almost a taking place in outer space, a scene for scene, line by line recreation of High Noon. It's the lone
Really?
marshal going after the bad guys who are coming there to get revenge on him. And it's, if you can watch the two movies side by side, there's scenes like in High Noon where he goes to the door and the doors are swinging in the saloon, and there's a saloon in the space station, and the same thing happens. I know I'm getting into the weeds here, but I'm just correlating how that myth has just perpetrated.
Yes. Yeah, we just kind of like, take those old mythologies and just kind of superimpose them onto modern day settings and characters. But keeping that same sense of like this vigilante and these, we're so tough, and that we're not afraid to shoot a bad guy if that's what we have to do, or whatever it is. And I do think that it's just something that we have just keep passing on and repurposing. It's just a fascinating obsession, a cultural obsession that we have. I will say, though, that I ended up, one of my episodes in this season is about an old friend of mine from, a family friend that we've had for a long time. And I ended up getting this really great audio of him giving a tour to some friends of his. And he was giving a tour around the Colorado-Wyoming border, basically like Cameron Pass and down through there, Woods Landing. And he ends up telling all these crazy stories of his childhood. He grew up in like the 40s in this area, and he basically was living the pioneer lifestyle well into this 20th century. It was just crazy. And like the school that he went to is just like a dirt cabin, like the floor was just a dirt floor with some magazines on it. And it is just very much still living that lifestyle. But it's crazy how many gun stories. At one point he's mad at his brother, and he's yelling after him as he's driving off in his truck, and he starts shooting his gun, and a bullet goes through the back window and shoots his brother in the knee. They're just always shooting somebody. There's a lot of guns, I have to say. So it's true that it wasn't quite like, there's no, shootouts at High Noon, not nearly as many of those as they like to portray in the movies, but guns were definitely part of a cowboying lifestyle, protecting your animals from predators, being able to put a horse down when it breaks a leg, whatever it is that you needed, you need a gun on hand. And they love to love to play with guns and do stuff with guns, man. There's a lot of crazy stories about ranchers and guns.
I bet, and I'm sure a lot of are probably a whole lot different, like you said, than we're used to seeing, like in TV and on movies and stuff like that. I guess to my thing is, I actually wrote a column for the paper a couple of years ago, and it was, and I wrote down to be your own. To embrace the High Noon thing was, if you saw somebody doing something wrong, that it was incumbent on us to stand up to the bad guys, and I didn't want everybody to go out and confront people and get into fights or shootouts, for crying out loud. But it was incumbent upon that to be like the marshal in, and I'm forgetting his name now, Will something, in High Noon, and stand up and do the right thing even in face of opposition and stuff like that. And I'm wondering if maybe I just helped perpetuate a really bad myth. maybe that wasn't the approach I should have taken on that, but it was kind of, I was just trying to urge people that see somebody doing something wrong in their parks or on their trails or in their open spaces, don't just write it off. Do something about it, even if you're the only voice out there. Was there a lot of that in the West? Was there a lot of the one person who maybe stood up in front of the town, at the in this town hall and said, this is wrong or right, or, have you heard much about that? I imagine it's probably not real documented.
It's, just being somebody who loves to read about American Western history, I would say no. There's the folks who stepped up and did what they had to do in their communities to make women's suffrage happen, for instance, or to bring about sort of a civilized way of life and kind of push back on the wild Western kind of chaos of the early days. But it does feel like, you hear stories about, like we had a community in eastern Wyoming that was it was like former slaves who were escaping Jim Crow laws and things like that. And they came out and they started a community here in eastern Wyoming. And, it didn't take long for neighboring communities to try and find reasons to arrest the mayor of that community and end up, hanging him. And there was nobody stepping up to say, hey, this isn't right. So you just hear a lot of injustice as well. Same thing with, there was another story here in Wyoming of a massacre of Chinese railroad workers, just terrible stuff like that. And where were the vigilantes then? Where was the vigilante to come up and say, hey, this isn't right. This is not what we do. I don't know. To me, it just seems like it's very much part of that mythology. And if only we had a few of those people, I do feel like I think what you're referring to is sort of the bystander effect. They did that research about, how many people, if they hear like somebody getting beaten up outside their door, will, step out and do something, call the police or do whatever you need to do. And it's just not, most people just don't want to get involved. And that's just, I think that we saw that in American Western history, that, for the most part, there weren't a lot of those sort of good guys who would make sure that, that we were on the right side of history, unfortunately.
I was probably projecting some of my previous career into that when I wrote that too. So probably putting some of what I did into that, and I made clear, don't go out and get yourself hurt. None of this is worth doing that. Let's talk a little bit. Let's carry that on a little bit further to modern day, and this is going to be a little political. I don't want to make a big political thing here. There is a mindset of what conservatism and liberalism is in this country. I think pretty much anybody who watches news can agree that what we see on the news is probably the far reaches at both ends of that. In my personal opinion, has long been people are pretty much mostly right down the center. They lean a little one way or the other depending on it. There is a view of people who live in the West like we do here in Utah and Arizona, New Mexico, Colorado, Wyoming, Montana. All these places are pretty much, these very much very conservative people, and I think they probably are. But is it true? Would it be accurate for me to say that they're probably more to the thing of, I'm going to just let people do their thing, I want to do my thing, and more toward libertarianism than conservative? Am I being on the right track here?
No, I think
probably
that's
not
true.
Saying it very well, but
yeah, that's okay. I know what you mean, and I think you're right. I think that there is one thing about Westerners that maybe is true about that sort of cowboy myth, which is that we're very much free spirits and we don't like getting sort of pegged as one thing or another. And I know that, there's a lot of people who kind of expect Westerners to vote a certain way, and you just never know, what's going to happen. And so I do think that there is very much a libertarian sort of spirit, and that you can't just write off Westerners as being any sort of political persuasion. And so, I think that's it's harder and harder to educate yourself that social media is kind of a corrupting factor, and that, in the West, we're still struggling with that, just like any place else. But for the most part, I think that, when I go out and talk to folks in my hometown of Walden, you can have a perfectly civilized conversation. You might not agree about everything, but everybody's perfectly happy to listen to what you have to say. And there, you never know on any given issue, you never know what their opinion's going to be. They're formulating their opinion the best they can with the best information they can get.
Yeah, I think it's very much done on a case-by-case basis. What's the topic? I'll tell you where I'm at on that, instead of being pigeonholed. And I think that's true for a lot of people. But I think it's especially true for the West. And one of the things that drew me here 30 years ago, after living on the East Coast for most of my life, was like, I want to go where there's more of a independence and an independent thinking and an independent. I think that, and you've kind of alluded to that during this conversation, is that they're very much libertarian, free-thinking people, but when it comes time for them to band together to help each other out, they also do that. And they do that on their own without necessarily relying on somebody else to tell them to do it. And that's kind of, if there's no pigeonhole there. They're kind of like, I'm doing my thing, but hey, my neighbor needs help. We're going to get together. We're going to help our neighbor and do that kind of thing. And yeah, there's no specific. I hate seeing anybody pigeonholed unless they really deserve it, but that's not even fair. I don't know that anybody deserves that. Melly, this has been a wonderful conversation. I'm now super excited to hear the podcast. I'm going to punch it into my little iPod here and be ready to just subscribe to it as soon as it goes live, which will be live the day this goes out. So it'll be May 11th. When your podcast, and tell us what the podcast is called again.
The podcast is The Modern West, and this season is called The Great Individualist.
And where can they find it? What's the website and everything for people who want to look at that?
Yeah, you can find it at themodernwest.org. But it's also just, if you listen to podcasts normally on Spotify or your Apple Podcast app or wherever, you can look it up, The Modern West, and there will be. And we're going to be releasing these episodes every 2 weeks on Wednesdays. So, first one coming out is going to be, just kind of going to just start right off with some myth busting about sort of the cowboy, and then get into all sorts of great history and meet all sorts of amazing characters.
I feel that we've just scratched the surface of the myth busting here today. How many episodes are there going to be in total for your series?
There's going to be 9 episodes this season. So
Excellent.
It's going to be a rich, exciting, plethora of stuff.
Excellent. Well, Melodie, thank you so much for being on the podcast. This has been a blast.
Yeah, it really has. It's been great, Bob. I can't wait to hear it.
Yeah, it's going to be a whole lot of fun. And thank you again for being on the podcast. And thanks, everyone, for your support and for listening to the Outdoors with Hiking Bob podcast. We'll talk to you next time.
Are you ready for great music in the great outdoors? Hey there, Colorado Springs. I'm Nicole Nicoletta, Executive Director of Rocky Mountain Highway Music Collaborative. I'm here to personally invite you to join us at the 13th Annual Meadowgrass Music Festival. It happens this Memorial Day weekend, May 27th through the 29th in beautiful Black Forest, Colorado. 3 days of live, local, regional, and national music. It's family friendly. Kids 12 and under get in free with a paid adult. You can join us for the 4th Annual Meadowgrass Beer Festival, yoga, on-site camping, and a phenomenal collection of local food, retail, and alcohol vendors. Tickets and information at RockyMountainHighway.org, or you can visit our Meadowgrass Facebook page. You should really come see why Meadowgrass is considered the premier kickoff to summer in the Pikes Peak region.